Hello, I'm Anthony. Today we're going to take a look at the subject of filters in synthesizers, or plug-in synthesizers more specifically. Pretty much every synth has a filter circuit, and in many cases it's possibly the most important component of the synthesizer because that's where we primarily colour the sound that we make. So it's hugely important to understand how they work. Now, being a naturally curious person, I like to understand how filters work, but unfortunately I'm not an electronics whiz. So today I'm going to attempt to tread that fine line between understanding something at a technical level. I do want to know how filters work, but not diving into the nitty-gritty of the actual electronics components themselves. If you find this video interesting today, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. It's an awesome way to help support my channel. Okay, this is how it's going to work today. We have a test harness. I've got 6 different synthesizers. I've volume matched each of these synthesizers, so when I hit a C, they're all going to generate a tone at about minus 20 decibels to within like 0.1 of a dB. They're really accurate. So we've got no volume bias here. I'm going to sweep through these synthesizers, having a look at their different filter circuits, and I'm going to compare and contrast and hopefully draw out some general principles that are useful to you. At the end of the day, it's what goes into our ears that matters. That's the most important thing. But I do like to have a little bit of a technical understanding of what's going on as well. So we're going to start off with probably the most famous filter circuit of all time, the resonant low-pass filter circuit from the Moog synthesizer family. This is the mini Moog that we're looking at here, but the filter originally was designed for the Moog modular system. Now, the Moog utilizes a 4-pole, 24 decibels per octave, resonant low-pass transistor ladder filter. I kid you not, all of those words mean something, and we're going to have a look at them today and try to figure out whether or not we're actually interested in what they mean. Here's my C. You see the slope on this filter curve. The level of attenuation of that curve, in other words, how much quieter it gets as we go up through the frequency range, is occurring at 24 decibels per octave. So between 2 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz, we're losing 24 decibels of level. And then between 4 kilohertz and 8 kilohertz, which is another octave above that point, we're losing another 24 decibels per octave. That's what gives you that logarithmic slope. So that's the 24 decibels per octave bit. Now, I threw in another little term there called 4-pole. Without diving too far down the electronics rabbit hole, basically a pole equates to 6 decibels per octave. So if you have a 24 decibels per octave filter, that is a 4-pole filter because it's 4 times 6. So if you ever see something describing a 2-pole filter, you know it's operating at 12 decibels per octave. It's always the level of attenuation away from the cutoff point. So we have this magical point in the middle of the filter called the cutoff. Everything revolves around that. Now, for each of these synths that I've set up today, I've set a cutoff frequency as close as possible to 2 kilohertz. So we're all operating with the same cutoff frequency. If we have a look in the spectrum analyzer and I press a note, it's actually pretty difficult to spot where that 2 kilohertz point is. And the reason for that is because when you're looking at spectrum analyzer curves, they're always naturally going to tilt down because low frequencies fundamentally have more energy, have more power than high frequencies. So you're always going to get this tail off. So how do we identify a cutoff in a filter? Well, the easiest way to do it is to boost the resonance. So this is introducing another one of those terms now. I called it a resonant low-pass filter. Resonance is essentially a feedback circuit. As part of the design of the filter, and it's called a topology. The topology is basically, it's the DNA or the blueprint of that filter. As part of that design, we have a feedback circuit inherently baked into it. So part of the signal that comes out of this filter is fed back into it. When we increase the resonance or emphasis or Q, there are lots of different controls that all basically mean the same thing. What you're effectively doing is increasing the amount of feedback into that filter circuit. That feedback is in turn centered around this magical cutoff point, the point in the frequency distribution where the return signal is going to be at its strongest. And that's why you get a spike in the frequency curve. Let's turn up the Q and we'll see it. There we go. So I've set my cutoff frequency at 2 kilohertz. And here is my resonance spike, my Q or emphasis at 2 kilohertz. That's because I'm progressively feeding more and more of the output signal back into the filter. It's getting accentuated more and more and more, and it's starting to poke through. Eventually, the filter starts generating its own electronic signal, its own sine wave, and we start hearing a sine wave at exactly 2 kilohertz. It doesn't matter what key I press on the keyboard, the resonant overtone that the filter circuit generates is going to be centered around the cutoff and exactly the cutoff. So let's play some different notes on the keyboard. And here is our resonant spike at exactly whatever the cutoff frequency is set to. So that's resonance demystified. It's simply feedback. Most low-pass filter circuits are also resonant. In fact, it's an inherent characteristic of this particular filter design, and it's called a ladder filter. So that's the topology of this particular filter, is a ladder filter. If you have a look at the circuit diagram for the Moog's resonant low-pass filter, it looks like a ladder. You have these two vertical bars with rungs in between, and those rungs effectively stipulate the behavior, the number of poles, and therefore the characteristics of the filter. All of this stuff ties in together. Part of the ladder design gives us a feedback circuit, and that's where the emphasis comes from. There's one last word that I used in that long-winded definition at the beginning. I called it a 4-pole, 24 decibels per octave, resonant low-pass transistor ladder filter. So that's the one final word that we have to deal with. There are two fundamental different kinds of ladder filters. You have transistor filters and diode filters, and you're literally swapping one of the components between transistors and diodes. They both perform very similar jobs, but they have different characteristics, and they result in different circuit topologies. Why is this important? Well, because different synthesizers use each of these different topologies. They're both ladder filters, but they actually end up sounding radically different. So here we have a transistor ladder filter, and some of the characteristics that you hear mentioned about transistor ladder filters are that they're warm and analog and rich. Fundamentally, it's because they're all based on this classic design that Bob Moog patented way back when. Be a little bit careful about inferring that every transistor ladder design is going to sound exactly like this, because there are many components in a Moog synthesizer, and yet sure, the topology of the filter is very important, but it's not an absolutely defining characteristic. It's very easy to get trapped into thinking, oh, well, this is a filter of this particular design, and so it's going to have these characteristics in this synthesizer. You're always going to need to use your ears to verify this stuff. What we're going to do now is bring in the second of our example instruments. This is the EMS Synthi, and here it is. The Synthi uses a diode ladder, so we're immediately going to be able to draw some conclusions about that. We know that the filter is going to be resonant because every ladder filter that I've encountered is resonant. I suppose it's theoretically possible that you could remove the feedback circuit from a ladder filter, but I've never seen that. So we can be pretty sure that this thing is going to be resonant. Now, one of the common characteristics of diode ladders is that they are highly variable. So these are some of your more unstable filters. You could theoretically design a diode ladder filter that wasn't unstable, but these general principles, they work out more often than not, which is why it's useful to have them. If you understand what kind of filter a synthesizer has, you stand a good chance of understanding quite a lot of its characteristics right out of the box. So here's the Synthi diode ladder filter. Let's compare it with the Mini V. I can actually do this inside Cubase using a comparison channel. What I'm doing now is I'm allowing myself to toggle between the Synthi and the Mini V by clicking on these blue and orange buttons. So at the moment we're in Synthi mode. I've left the resonance. Look at this, you see, this is good. I can see that I've left the resonance on the Mini V. I can't hear it, but can you see this big spike? That's the resonant peak of the Mini V. So I'm just going to nip in and turn that back down again. Sometimes we have happy accidents. So I want to do a comparison of these two sounds. There's my Synthi V. Can you see all of those orange peaks? Let's turn it down a bit. All this orange stuff in the upper region of the comparison chart is showing you that blue is Synthi, orange is mini V. The mini V is brighter in the upper frequencies, and indeed we can hear that. If I flip over to the mini V, I understand we can't hear it at the moment. Let's just look at it first. There's a comparison of the mini V versus the Synthi. It's actually kind of tricky to see, but the mini V is just a kind of a fundamentally stronger signal. There's a little bit of blue poking out, which is telling me that the Synthi is slightly louder in the low frequency regions, and that's what's allowing it to play this minus 20 dB equalization game. But the mini V is a lot brighter in the upper frequencies. Let's hear it again. So there's the comparative brightness of the mini V versus the dull softness of the Synthi. So these are identical, or well, I'm attempting to generate identical tones. They're both sawtooth oscillators with nothing else on the synthesizers, just going through a 2 kilohertz cutoff. This is why it's really useful to understand the individual characteristics of your synthesizer. The filter oscillator in the Synthi is a weird thing, and it's using a weird filter topology. The diode ladder is quite uncommon in synths. There aren't that many of them. The Synthi is a great example of one. What you tend to get is quite a dirty filtered sound, even though we've thrown a lot of those high frequencies away. If you listen very carefully, it's quite raspy. When we jump back over to the mini V, sure, it's much richer in those higher frequencies, so it's going to sound brighter, but it's less harsh. So that's kind of cool. 2 different ladder filters, completely different characteristics, because one of them's based on transistors and one of them's based on diodes. Do you need to know that? No. Is it cool? Yes. I love knowing this stuff. Filter number 3, the Oberheim SEM, here it is, uses a different kind of filter topology. This is called a state variable filter. So what we have here is a different configuration, a completely different configuration of electronic components. It uses a ring of components called op-amps. Let's not worry about what op-amps do today. It's just a completely different design, fundamentally different way of doing the same job. Let's hear it before we go any further. One thing that you might immediately have noticed is the gentler curve. This is a 12 decibel per octave filter, or 2-pole state variable filter. Why am I concentrating on this business about state variable? Well, one of the characteristics of the state variable filter design is that you have multiple different filters fundamentally baked into that design for free. And you actually see it implemented in the SEM in a really interesting way. Have a look at this control here. We have a band pass, low pass, notch, and high pass, all on the same control. Now, admittedly, you can't get access to them all at the same time. If you turn this control all the way to the left, you get a pure band pass filter. What's going on there is you've combined a low pass and a high pass filter together. That's what a band pass is. If we come out of band pass mode, we switch into pure low pass mode. So now we're just doing one filter. We're cutting away the high frequency stuff. But as soon as I turn this knob a little bit more, now I'm mixing 2 different kinds of filters. I have a low pass filter and a notch filter simultaneously. It's doing those 2 jobs simultaneously. Let's try to see if we can find any of that stuff. Absolutely. There's your notch. So that is the combination of a low pass filter and a notch filter. By the time we get to 12 o'clock, we've thrown all of the low pass away and we have a pure notch filter. And then from that point onwards, we combine notch and band pass. So we're going to start throwing away low frequencies. And this, it looks a little bit odd when you throw away low frequencies. You end up with a fundamental that's no longer the loudest harmonic. And it sounds really thin and nasal. So that's an example of a state variable filter in operations. One of the advantages, one of the benefits you get from using that particular topology, you're able to mix and match multiple different filter types together simultaneously. Let's turn it back round to low pass mode, and we'll compare the SEM with another 12 decibels per octave or two-pole filter. That's the Korg MS20. Let's have a quick look at this one. Now this is very similar in sound at the moment to the SEM. We're going to compare them directly in a moment. The MS20 doesn't use a state variable filter. This is yet another different kind of topology. In fact, the MS20 uses proprietary technology that isn't fundamentally based on any individual filter design. But now the filter design of the Korg M20 is such an area of dark art that I was able to bemuse ChatGPT talking to it earlier today, because I asked ChatGPT a simple question. I said to it, which synthesizers use Salon key filters? Salon key is another topology. So this is the third topology that we've come across so far. You have ladder filters, state variable filters, and Salon key filters. Those are the three terms that you're most often going to come across. In my forum searching in preparation for this video, I read that the Korg MS20 used a Salon key filter topology. So I asked ChatGPT which synthesizers use Salon key filters, and here we go. Number one, the Korg MS20. Both the original model and reissues, we'll get to that in a minute, use Salon key filters. Now, in my preparation, I'd also read a forum post that said that the Korg MS20 was a unique filter design. So I asked ChatGPT a different question. I asked it, does the Korg MS20 use a Salon key filter? And ChatGPT apologized to me. It said, oh, you know what? No, it doesn't. It's actually a proprietary design based on its own circuitry. This pretty much tells you everything you need to know about investigating filter topologies. It's so confusing that even ChatGPT doesn't know what it's talking about. Do you fundamentally need to understand whether or not the MS20 uses a Salon key topology or not? No, you don't. Absolutely you don't. I would have liked to have had an answer, and I would have liked to have had a definitive list of filter topologies that are the family, the fathers of all others. It's simply not true. Korg have come up with their own entirely proprietary way of filtering sound, and in fact over the design course of the MS20's life, they've used two different filter designs, and they're called Mark 1 and Mark 2. We have a control for it. So by default, when you load an MS20 template sound, it's using Mark II filter, which is something called an OTA filter, and I've gone down enough rabbit holes today, so we're not going to talk about that. Look it up if you need to. Operational transconductance amplifiers. That's what the OTA filter sounds like. If we switch over to a Mark I, this is an entirely proprietary filter based on its own circuit design, its own chip. Admittedly, it's subtle, but the Mark I, it's just got a bit more bite to it. Slightly different filters, not the end of the world. I like to know what the difference is between those two. Now I do. Different designs, but both proprietary, tied to the Korg branding. Okay, let's run a difference between the proprietary filter coming out of the Korg MS20 and the more kind of standardized state variable filter from the Oberheim SEM. I've reset the MS20 back to Mark II filter, and I've also just verified that my loudnesses were right, because this is the second attempt I've made to do this, and my volumes were slightly different between these synths. Okay, so we set up the comparison channel, so we've got Korg on blue and SEM on orange. So we can see that the SEM is brighter, all of those orange peaks. Let's flip over to the SEM. Now we can hear that extra brightness. Both sawtooths operating at 2 kHz cutoffs. Synthesizer number 5 is the Jupiter. So we're back to 24 decibels territory now. It actually has a switch on this synth, currently in 24 dB mode. So this is a 4-pole filter. The Jupiter isn't a ladder filter, but it's called a cascading OTA filter, which basically means it has kind of some characteristics of the ladder filter, but a little bit more reading will reveal to you that the Jupiter uses a particular type of filter called a Butterworth filter. And one of the characteristics of that particular filter is that it's very smooth. It has a gentle attenuation of frequencies past the cutoff range. The Jupiter and the Juno, both of which use the very similar filter designs, both employ Butterworth filters, and they have beautiful, warm, smooth, accurate filter responses. There's very little harshness or raspiness to that. Let's compare that with the Mini Moog, another 24 decibels per octave filter. You might be thinking to yourself, you can't compare a Jupiter with a Mini Moog, for God's sake, they're completely different beasts. Well, actually, the filter responses are pretty similar. So we're hearing the Jupiter here. You can see that the Mini V has some brighter frequencies. Again, it's got a different distribution curve. So the Jupiter is absolutely stable, and the Mini Moog has this steeper curve because it isn't using a Butterworth filter. If we jump over to the Mini V, there's those extra bright frequencies because we've got just a little bit more of a bump. Finally today, one last filter to look at. This is the Steiner-Parker filter from Arturia's Mini Brute. This is based on remember I was talking about the Salon key topology, one of the basic kind of principles of design. One of the advantages of the Steiner-Parker filter is that it's multi-mode. So in a similar way that the state variable filter, which is intrinsically multi-mode, the Steiner-Parker filter is also multi-mode. Here is our multi-mode switch, but it's not using the ring of op-amps that the state variable filter uses. It uses its own proprietary topology. What we get, however, is a 12 decibels per octave, 2-pole, multi-mode resonant filter. And let's compare that with our other 12 decibels per octave multi-mode filter, in this case the state variable filter from the SEM. So the SEM is brighter. You can see the orange peaks just popping up. You'd have to be looking at a fairly high resolution monitor to be able to see this stuff. But there's a few little orange peaks there. Jump over to the SEM. And actually, when I'm looking at the oscilloscope as well, the Mini Brute has softer curves on the saws. And it's probably that sharpness. It's just kind of cool to coincide what you're hearing with your eyes and verify that everything is working correctly. The main takeaway that I wanted to convey with this is that the world of filters is fascinating. There are so many different design variances between the different synthesizers. It's all just so cool. Hopefully you enjoyed this video today. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.